Inside a single red brick building in Huntsville, Texas, more human beings have been executed than anywhere else on Earth. Since 1982 alone, 598 people have been put to death inside these walls, more than 4 times the number of any other state in America. 7 of those executions belong to men and women whose names became synonymous with terror long before they ever arrived at the Huntsville Unit. One of them had already been sentenced to death once, been released back into society, and killed again before anyone could stop him. Another dragged a man to his death behind a pickup truck for 3 miles along a rural Texas road, and felt nothing. A third drifted across the entire country, leaving bodies in his wake for 15 years before law enforcement finally caught up with him. What the records show about what happened inside this facility, about how these 7 people lived, what they said, and how they died, is something most documentaries have never told in full. This is the complete and documented story of the 7 most feared death row inmates ever executed at the Huntsville Unit.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
Kenneth Allen McDuff was born on March 21, 1946, in the small central Texas town of Rosebud, the 5th of 6 children born to John Allen McDuff and his wife Addie. By most accounts, the family was comfortable, even prosperous by local standards. John McDuff ran a successful concrete business during the Texas construction boom of the 1960s, and the family never wanted for money or stability. But comfort and discipline are not the same thing, and in the McDuff household, discipline was something Kenneth never received. His mother Addie was known around Rosebud as the pistol-packing mama, a nickname she earned by carrying a firearm in her purse and threatening anyone she believed had wronged her children. She indulged Kenneth relentlessly, shielding him from consequences that other children in that town would have faced without question. Neighbors and classmates remembered him as a bully with a hair-trigger temper who was coddled every time his behavior crossed a line. He shot his .22 rifle at living creatures for entertainment and got into fights with boys older and larger than himself, not out of courage but out of a need to dominate. The local sheriff knew his name before Kenneth McDuff had committed a single serious crime, and that fact alone tells you something about the trajectory that was already in motion. His first brush with the law came in 1964 when he was convicted of 12 counts of burglary and attempted burglary across 3 Texas counties. He was 18 years old. He received 12 4-year prison terms to be served concurrently and was paroled in December of 1965 after serving less than 2 years. Whatever lesson the criminal justice system intended to deliver with that sentence, it did not reach Kenneth McDuff. Within months of his release, he was back in the company of men who shared his appetite for recklessness, and within a year he had committed the crime that would define the first chapter of his public infamy. On the night of August 6, 1966, McDuff and a younger acquaintance named Roy Dale Green spent the day pouring concrete for McDuff's father in Temple, Texas. That evening the 2 men drove around the area with no stated purpose, which in Kenneth McDuff's case was always the condition most dangerous to anyone who crossed his path. They came across a car parked near a baseball diamond at a local high school where 3 teenagers were spending the evening together. 17-year-old Robert Brand, his cousin Mark Dunham, and Robert's 16-year-old girlfriend Edna Louise Sullivan. McDuff approached the vehicle armed with a .38 Colt revolver. Green carried a broken 3-foot broomstick handle from the back of McDuff's car. McDuff forced all 3 teenagers into the trunk of their Ford at gunpoint and told Green to follow in McDuff's own vehicle as he drove the teenagers' car down unlit county roads into the darkness outside of town. He stopped on an isolated farm road, opened the trunk, and shot both boys in the head. He told Green they had gotten a good look at his face and could not be left alive. He then removed Edna Sullivan from the trunk, drove her to a 3rd location, and subjected her to hours of rape and sexual torture before using the broomstick handle to crush her throat. Falls County Sheriff Brady Pamplin, one of the first lawmen to work the McDuff cases, later described what McDuff did to Edna Sullivan as something a man does when he feels absolutely no connection to another human being's suffering. Roy Dale Green, stricken with guilt, turned himself into police the following day and gave a full confession. In exchange for his testimony against McDuff, Green received a lesser sentence. McDuff went to trial and was convicted of capital murder. He was sentenced to death in the electric chair for the murder of Robert Brand. 3 death sentences were handed down in total. Kenneth Allen McDuff arrived on Texas death row in 1966 as one of the most reviled inmates in the state's custody, and for a time it appeared that the electric chair at the Huntsville Unit would be his final destination. But the chair never came for him. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Furman v. Georgia that the death penalty as then administered constituted cruel and unusual punishment, and every death sentence in the country was effectively suspended. McDuff's 3 death sentences were commuted to life imprisonment. Texas prisons in the late 1970s and 1980s were operating under federal court orders to reduce overcrowding, and the pressure to move inmates through the system was immense. In October of 1989, after serving roughly 20 years, Kenneth Allen McDuff was granted parole. He was one of 20 former death row inmates and 127 convicted murderers paroled during that period. He walked out of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice a free man, supported by his family, given a car and a credit card, and set loose on the Interstate 35 corridor of Central Texas. Law enforcement officials who had dealt with McDuff for decades were horrified. Prosecutors and investigators who knew his file understood that what had just happened was not rehabilitation. It was a catastrophe waiting to unfold. The catastrophe did not wait long. Within weeks of his release, a woman named Rafael Parker disappeared, her body found just 3 days after McDuff walked out of prison. Investigators suspected his involvement but could not prove it at the time. Over the next 3 years, McDuff preyed primarily on women working as sex workers along the highways and truck stops of the I-35 corridor, where his access to a vehicle and cash made him a familiar and seemingly unthreatening figure in their world. He killed Brenda Thompson in October of 1991, driving her to a wooded area after a roadblock encounter where witnesses had seen a woman attempting to kick out the windshield of his car with her hands tied behind her back. He killed Regina Deanne Moore that same month, tying her arms and legs before leaving her body in a remote area near Waco. In December of 1991, he and an accomplice named Alva Hank Worley were driving near Austin when McDuff spotted Colleen Reed, a 30-year-old accountant, washing her car at a car wash. Reed was not a sex worker. She was a professional woman washing her car on a December night in Austin, and Kenneth McDuff grabbed her by the throat in full view of witnesses, pulled her into his vehicle, and drove away before anyone could intervene. Worley later testified that McDuff had raped and murdered Reed before disposing of her body, though her remains would not be found for another 7 years. His final confirmed victim was Melissa Northrup, a 22-year-old convenience store clerk and pregnant mother of 2 who disappeared from her workplace in Waco on March 1, 1992. Her body was found weeks later by a fisherman in a gravel pit 90 miles from Waco. She had been 9 months pregnant at the time of her abduction. By the spring of 1992, Texas law enforcement had connected enough of the disappearances to McDuff that an arrest warrant was issued, but he had already fled. A nationwide manhunt followed. Deputy United States Marshals Mike and Parnell McNamara led the pursuit. McDuff was featured on the television program America's Most Wanted, and a civilian viewer recognized him and called in a tip. He was arrested in Kansas City, Missouri on May 4, 1992, working at a construction site under a false identity. He was extradited to Texas and charged with the capital murders of Melissa Northrup and Colleen Reed in separate trials. Both juries sentenced him to death. Kenneth Allen McDuff became the only man in American history to be assigned 2 different death row numbers, the first from 1966 and the second from the 1990s. He was transported to the Huntsville Unit, where Texas's male death row population had been consolidated, and held there through years of appeals. Investigators spent the entirety of his time on death row pressing him to reveal the locations of his victims' remains. He refused for years, using the information as leverage. Only in the final weeks before his execution did he agree to provide locations, and even then only after being guaranteed that he would not lose his commissary privileges. On October 6, 1998, investigators took him out of prison under tight security and drove him to Falls County, where he directed them to the shallow grave containing the remains of Colleen Reed, 7 years after her death. He was then returned to custody and transported to the Huntsville Unit for execution. On November 17, 1998, Kenneth Allen McDuff was strapped to the gurney in the Huntsville execution chamber and administered a lethal injection of pentobarbital. His last words were 4. He looked toward the ceiling and said, "I am ready to be released. Release me." He was pronounced dead at 6:26 in the evening. His family did not claim his body. He is buried at the Captain Joe Byrd Cemetery in Huntsville, his headstone marked only with his death row number and the date of his execution. His crimes forced the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to overhaul its entire parole eligibility and revocation system. The resulting legislative reforms became known across Texas as the McDuff Laws, a permanent institutional scar left by a man the system created, released, and was ultimately forced to execute twice. Where Kenneth McDuff represented the systemic failure of a justice system that released a known killer back into the world, Karla Faye Tucker represented something that made the public deeply uncomfortable in an entirely different way: the possibility that a person capable of monstrous violence could, in the years that followed, become someone almost unrecognizable from the person who committed it. That discomfort did not save her. On February 3, 1998, she became the first woman executed in the state of Texas since 1863, and the first woman executed in the United States since 1984. The debate surrounding her case exposed fault lines in the American conversation about capital punishment that have never fully closed. Karla Faye Tucker was born on November 18, 1959 in Houston, Texas, the youngest of 3 daughters in a household marked by chaos, instability, and neglect. Her mother, Carolyn Tucker, was by multiple accounts a deeply troubled woman who introduced Karla to marijuana at age 8 and heroin by the time she was a young teenager. Her parents divorced when she was still a child, and the household she grew up in offered little in the way of structure or protection. By the time she was 13, she had dropped out of school and was accompanying her mother to biker bars, where she was introduced to a lifestyle of drugs, transient relationships, and street-level survival. She began working as a prostitute in her early teens, by her own later admission, and the world she inhabited through her adolescence and early adulthood was one defined by addiction, violence, and instability. She moved through relationships with men in the biker subculture of Houston's East Side, and by her early 20s she was deeply embedded in a world from which, on the surface, there appeared to be no exit. In the early hours of June 13, 1983, 23-year-old Karla Faye Tucker and her then-boyfriend Daniel Ryan Garrett broke into the Houston apartment of 27-year-old Jerry Lynn Dean, a man Tucker reportedly despised following a prior relationship. Dean was not alone. In his bed was a woman named Deborah Thornton, 32 years old, whom Dean had met at a party just hours earlier. What followed, according to court testimony, the confession Karla Faye Tucker later gave to investigators, and the findings of the Houston Police Department, was a prolonged and savage attack. Tucker and Garrett beat Dean with a hammer and struck him repeatedly. Tucker then retrieved a pickaxe from a corner of the room and used it to deliver multiple blows to both Dean and Thornton. Deborah Thornton, still alive after the initial assault, was left pinned to the floor by the pickaxe, which Tucker left embedded in her body. Both victims died at the scene. Neighbors reported hearing screams and what sounded like prolonged struggle but did not call police until the following morning. Investigators arrived to find a scene they later described in court as among the most brutal they had encountered in their careers. Tucker and Garrett fled. In the days that followed, Tucker reportedly told associates about the killings. According to testimony presented at trial, she described the experience of using the pickaxe and stated that she felt a surge of sexual pleasure with each blow. This statement, which Tucker herself later disputed or contextualized differently in interviews, became one of the most widely reported and damaging elements of her public case. It was seized upon by prosecutors and repeated in press coverage in a way that cemented a particular image of Karla Faye Tucker in the public mind long before her trial began. She and Garrett were arrested in July 1983 after a relative of Garrett's contacted police. Tucker gave a detailed confession. The investigation was thorough and the physical evidence was overwhelming. In April 1984, she was convicted of capital murder by a Harris County jury and sentenced to death. Daniel Ryan Garrett was also convicted and sentenced to death, though he died of liver disease on death row in 1993 before his execution could be carried out. Tucker was transferred to the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, which housed Texas's female death row population. She arrived there in 1984 and would spend the next 14 years inside that facility. What happened to Karla Faye Tucker during those 14 years became the center of one of the most contested capital punishment debates in American history. Within months of her arrival, she became involved with a prison ministry program and underwent what she and those around her described as a profound religious conversion. She became an evangelical Christian, married a prison minister named Dana Brown through a proxy arrangement, and became by all documented accounts a model inmate whose behavior over 14 years generated not a single serious disciplinary infraction. Fellow inmates, correctional officers, and prison chaplains all provided testimony to this effect. Prison staff documented her as a calming influence on other inmates, a woman who counseled those in crisis and maintained an atmosphere of stability in the unit around her. Pat Robertson, the Reverend Jerry Falwell, and Pope John Paul II all made public appeals for clemency on her behalf. Her case drew international press coverage and became a flashpoint in the national argument over whether rehabilitation and redemption have any place in the calculus of capital punishment. In January of 1998, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 14-0 against recommending clemency. Governor George W. Bush, who was at that point preparing to launch a presidential campaign, denied her clemency request on February 2, 1998, the day before her scheduled execution. Bush stated publicly that it was not his place to substitute his judgment for that of the jury that had sentenced her. Tucker gave a final interview to television journalist Larry King from the Mountain View Unit in the days before her execution, speaking calmly and without apparent fear about her faith and her readiness to die. On the morning of February 3, 1998, she was transported from the Mountain View Unit to the Huntsville Unit for execution. She entered the chamber and was strapped to the gurney. Her final statement, delivered clearly and without hesitation, was addressed to the family of her victims, to her own family, and to the prison staff who had supervised her for 14 years. She thanked them. She expressed sorrow and love. She was pronounced dead at 6:45 in the evening, 14 minutes after the lethal injection began. Witnesses on both sides of the glass, victims' family members and Tucker's own supporters, were present. Some wept. The warden on duty that evening later stated in interviews that in his years overseeing executions at the Huntsville Unit, the night of February 3, 1998 remained among the most difficult he had experienced. Karla Faye Tucker was 41 years old. Her execution did not end the debate her case had ignited. In many ways it only deepened it, and the questions her story raised about the nature of justice, change, and punishment continue to be asked every time the state of Texas schedules an execution. Rafael Resendez-Ramirez was a different kind of predator from the two who came before him. Kenneth McDuff operated in a defined geographic corridor, preying on vulnerable women along the highways of central Texas. Karla Faye Tucker's crimes, however savage, unfolded in a single night. Resendez-Ramirez moved like a ghost across the entire country, arriving without warning, killing with extreme violence, and disappearing back into the freight rail network that runs through the spine of America before any investigation could get traction. For nearly 2 years he was one of the most wanted fugitives in United States history, a man who had been deported from the country multiple times and kept returning, riding freight trains across state lines and leaving a trail of bodies near railroad tracks from Texas to Kentucky to Illinois. The FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted list. Law enforcement in 3 states coordinated their efforts. And still he killed. Understanding how that was possible, and understanding the systemic failures that allowed it, requires understanding who Rafael Resendez-Ramirez was long before the killings began. He was born Ángel Maturino Resendez on August 1, 1959, in Izúcar de Matamoros in the Mexican state of Puebla. His early life in Mexico was marked by poverty and instability, and by his early 20s he had developed a pattern of crossing the United States border illegally and committing crimes on American soil before returning to Mexico. Immigration and Naturalization Service records document that he was apprehended and deported from the United States on at least 9 documented occasions between 1976 and 1998. Each time he was removed. Each time he returned. The revolving door of deportation and re-entry that defined his relationship with the American border became one of the most politically charged aspects of his case after his crimes became public, and it remains a source of documented institutional criticism to this day. He drifted through the American Southwest and Midwest during the 1980s and 1990s, accumulating arrests for burglary, assault, and other offenses across multiple states, serving short sentences, and being released or deported before law enforcement in any single jurisdiction could build a comprehensive picture of who they were dealing with. His first confirmed murder in the United States took place on August 29, 1997, when he broke into the home of Dr. Claudia Benton, a 39-year-old pediatric neurologist, near a railroad track in the Houston suburb of West University Place. Dr. Benton was beaten, sexually assaulted, and stabbed to death inside her own home. Her husband discovered her body upon returning home. Investigators found evidence of a violent break-in and sexual assault but had no immediate suspect. The case went cold for months. Meanwhile, Resendez-Ramirez continued to move. On October 4, 1998, he attacked Leafy Mason, an 81-year-old woman living alone near a railroad track in Hughes Springs, Texas, beating her to death with a water heater from her own home. On December 17, 1998, he killed Noemi Dominguez, a 26-year-old schoolteacher in Weimar, Texas, beating her to death inside her residence near the Southern Pacific Rail line. On the same night and in the same area he killed Josephine Convica, an 73-year-old woman, with a pickaxe. On December 25, 1998, Christmas Day, he entered the home of Reverend Norman Cernick and his wife Karen Cernick near the Union Pacific Rail line in Weimar, Texas, and beat both of them to death with a sledgehammer. The Cernicks were found by congregation members who arrived for Christmas services and found the parsonage door open. By early 1999, Texas Rangers and FBI investigators had connected the crimes through the geographic pattern. Each murder occurred within a short distance of an active railroad line, and had developed Resendez-Ramirez as a primary suspect. His name was placed on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list on June 21, 1999. His photograph was broadcast nationally. On June 2, 1999, before the Most Wanted listing was even public, he crossed back into the United States from Mexico at El Paso and immediately traveled to Kentucky, where he broke into the home of Christopher Meyer, a 21-year-old University of Kentucky student, and his girlfriend near a railroad track in Lexington. He beat Meyer to death with a rock and sexually assaulted the girlfriend, who survived and later provided critical testimony. He then returned to Texas, where on June 4, 1999, he broke into the home of Carolyn Conkler near a railroad track in Gorham, Illinois, and beat her to death. At this point, the multi-state investigation had reached a level of urgency that brought the case to national television, and it was that exposure that ultimately ended his killing spree, not through a dramatic law enforcement confrontation, but through an unexpected negotiation. Resendez-Ramirez had a sister named Manuela Resendez living in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Texas Ranger Drew Carter established contact with her and, working through her, negotiated with Resendez-Ramirez directly over a period of weeks. The Ranger promised him safe passage and humane treatment in exchange for surrender. On July 13, 1999, Rafael Resendez-Ramirez walked across the International Bridge at El Paso and surrendered personally to Ranger Carter, who was waiting for him on the American side. He was taken into custody without incident. The negotiated surrender of one of America's most wanted serial killers at an international bridge in broad daylight was an event that drew enormous press attention and considerable debate about the conduct of the negotiation. He was transported to Harris County, Texas, where he was tried for the murder of Dr. Claudia Benton, the crime for which the prosecution had the most complete physical evidence. The trial began in May 2000. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty and sentencing him to death. He was transferred to the Huntsville Unit and placed on death row, where he spent the next 6 years through a series of appeals. During his time on death row, he was documented as a cooperative inmate who caused no significant disciplinary issues. He spoke with investigators on multiple occasions and provided information about his crimes, though the full extent of his victim count was never definitively established. Some investigators believe the number of people he killed may have exceeded the 9 confirmed victims. In 2006, as his execution date approached, he recanted a previously stated claim that God had told him to kill his victims and expressed remorse for the first time. On June 27, 2006, he was transported from the Huntsville Unit to the Huntsville Unit and strapped to the execution chamber gurney. His final statement was addressed to the families of his victims. He asked for their forgiveness. He said he wanted to ask if it was in their hearts to forgive him, expressed love for his own family, and stated his faith in God. He was pronounced dead at 8:05 in the evening. He was 46 years old. The 9 families whose loved ones he had murdered received his final words in silence. Most declined to comment publicly afterward. The railroad tracks near which he had killed continued to carry freight through those same Texas towns long after his execution, and the houses near those tracks remained standing, most of them now occupied by families who had moved in after the crimes, some of whom had no idea what had happened within those walls before they arrived. The story of Rafael Resendez-Ramirez also exposed something critical about the machinery of institutional oversight in the American criminal justice and immigration systems that went far beyond the crimes of a single individual. Federal investigators and congressional oversight committees examining his case after his arrest documented that he had been apprehended by law enforcement agencies at least 3 times in the months immediately preceding some of his murders and had been released or deported rather than held for further investigation. On one occasion in 1999, his name had already appeared on an INS watch list when he was encountered at a checkpoint and released due to a processing error. A congressional subcommittee investigation found that interagency communication failures between the INS, the FBI, and local law enforcement had directly contributed to his continued freedom during the period of his most active killing. The documented conclusion of that investigation was not that any single officer or agent had acted with malice, but that the system itself, the architecture of information sharing, the protocols for handling repeat deportees with criminal histories, the absence of a unified database accessible to all relevant agencies in real time, had failed in ways that cost 9 people their lives. That finding was entered into the public record and led to specific reforms in cross-agency data sharing that remain in effect today, a systemic consequence that Rafael Resendez-Ramirez left behind him along with the grief of 9 families and the memory of a freight train disappearing into the Texas dark. Tommy Lynn Sells arrived in this world already disadvantaged in ways that courts and investigators would later spend years trying to understand. He was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, one of twins, but his twin sister died shortly after birth. His mother, already struggling, sent him to live with a family friend in Missouri when he was very young, and his early childhood was defined by a succession of temporary placements, neglect, and reported sexual abuse at the hands of an adult in one of those households. He returned to his mother's care intermittently, but the stability he needed was never consistently present. By the time he was a teenager, he had developed what investigators would later describe as a complete disconnection from the emotional consequences of his actions toward other people. He began drinking heavily as an adolescent, started using drugs, and at 14 years old, by his own account in later interviews, he committed his first killing. That claim, like many of his subsequent statements, could not be fully verified by investigators, but the pattern it described, a childhood of trauma escalating into violence before he was old enough to drive, was consistent with the documented trajectory of his adult life. Sells became a drifter, moving across the United States by hitchhiking and riding freight, a lifestyle that bears an unsettling parallel to Rafael Resendez-Ramirez and that made him extraordinarily difficult to track. He moved from state to state, took day labor jobs, slept rough, and preyed on victims he encountered through the transient networks of motels, truck stops, and rural highways that form a shadow infrastructure across America's interior. He claimed responsibility for killings in at least a dozen states, though investigators working the case after his arrest were ultimately able to verify 17 confirmed victims and suspected his actual count was significantly higher. He told one interviewer, "I am hatred. When you look at me, you look at hate. I don't know what love is." That statement, delivered in a flat and matter-of-fact tone, was broadcast widely and became one of the most disturbing pieces of interview footage associated with any Texas death row case of that era. His arrest came as the result of a single crime committed on the night of December 31, 1999, in Del Rio, Texas. Sells broke into the home of a family acquaintance and attacked 13-year-old Katie Harris as she slept, cutting her throat. Katie's friend Crystal Searles, 10 years old, was also attacked and had her throat cut, but survived by playing dead and later crawling to a neighboring property for help. Crystal Searles' survival and her ability to describe her attacker in detail led investigators directly to Tommy Lynn's cells. He was arrested in January 2000 in Del Rio and confessed to the murder of Katie Harris. The investigation that followed his arrest connected him to killings across the country spanning more than 15 years. He was tried in Val Verde County for the murder of Katie Harris, convicted in 2000 and sentenced to death. He was housed at the Polunsky Unit on death row and remained there for 14 years through multiple rounds of appeals. His execution was scheduled for April 3, 2014, but was briefly halted by a district court ruling requiring Texas to disclose information about its lethal injection drug supplier. A federal appeals court overturned that ruling the following day, and the United States Supreme Court declined to intervene. Searles declined to make a final statement. He took several breaths, closed his eyes, and was pronounced dead at 6:27 in the evening. He was 49 years old. Crystal Searles, the 10-year-old girl who had survived his attack 14 years earlier, had grown into a young woman by the time of his execution. She did not attend but gave interviews in the days that followed in which she described her long journey towards something she was careful not to call closure, because the word did not fully capture what actually remained after a crime like that one. That was the story of Tommy Lynn Searles. But inside the same walls where he had spent his final years, another case was unfolding. One that became the most nationally visible hate crime prosecution in the history of the Texas justice system and one whose consequences reached all the way to the floor of the United States Congress. Lawrence Russell Brewer was born on March 13, 1967, in Sulphur Springs, Texas, a town in the northeastern part of the state about an hour and a half from Dallas. His early life left few dramatic markers in the public record. He was not from a household defined by the kind of extreme poverty or documented abuse that shaped the backgrounds of McDuff or Searles. What the record does show is a young man who moved quickly into petty crime, drug possession, burglary, and who served time in Texas State Prison in the early 1990s. It was inside the Texas prison system that Lawrence Brewer's trajectory changed permanently, because it was there that he encountered John William King and became deeply embedded in a white supremacist prison gang affiliated with a KKK splinter group called the Confederate Knights of America. Both men covered their bodies with racist tattoos during their time inside, and both men carried those beliefs and that iconography with them when they were released. By the spring of 1998, Brewer had been released from prison and had traveled to Jasper, a small town in deep East Texas, to stay with King, who was living with a mutual friend named Sean Berry. On the night of June 7, 1998, Brewer, King, and Berry were driving through Jasper when they encountered 49-year-old James Byrd Jr. walking along the roadside. Byrd was a black man from Jasper who was well known around town and who was walking home from a party. He accepted the offer of a ride. Instead of taking him home, the three men drove him to a remote logging road outside of town, stopped the truck and attacked him. They beat him severely. They sprayed his face with black paint. They then chained him by the ankles to the back of Berry's pickup truck using a 24.5-foot logging chain and drove. James Byrd Jr. was dragged for approximately 3 miles along the asphalt surface of Huff Creek Road. Forensic evidence presented at trial established that he remained alive and conscious for a significant portion of that distance, attempting to hold his head up from the road. He was killed approximately halfway through the dragging when his body struck a culvert, severing his right arm and his head. The three men drove on for another mile and a half before dumping what remained of his body in front of a black cemetery. They then drove to a barbecue. Police found 81 separate locations containing portions of James Byrd's remains scattered across 3 miles of rural road. The investigation was swift. Physical evidence tied all three men to the scene within 24 hours. A note found in John King's apartment, written to Brewer, was entered into evidence at trial. It read in part, "We have made history and shall die proudly remembered if need be. Much Aryan love, respect, and honor, my brother in arms." Brewer was tried in Bryan, Texas, with the trial moved from Jasper due to the case's notoriety. DNA evidence showed Byrd's blood on all three defendants. Brewer took the stand and claimed he had been a bystander, that he had kicked Byrd reflexively to break up a fight, that Berry had been the one to chain Byrd to the truck. The jury did not believe him. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 1999. John King was also convicted and sentenced to death. Sean Berry, who prosecutors conceded was not a white supremacist and who showed remorse, received a life sentence. Brewer was transferred to the Polunsky Unit and held on death row for 12 years. His documented behavior during that time was not marked by rehabilitation or reflection. He maintained his white supremacist beliefs and showed no remorse for the murder of James Byrd Jr. in any documented statement or prison record. On September 21, 2011, he was transported to the Huntsville Unit for execution. He ordered an enormous final meal, chicken fried steaks, a triple meat bacon cheeseburger, a cheese omelet, fried okra, barbecue, fajitas, pizza, and a slab of peanut butter fudge, and then ate none of it. His refusal to eat his requested last meal prompted Texas State Senator John Whitmire to contact the TDCJ and demand that the practice of providing special last meals to condemned inmates be abolished entirely. The TDCJ complied, and from that point forward all condemned inmates in Texas have received the same meal as the rest of the prison population on their execution day. Lawrence Russell Brewer's final act of defiance, refusing to eat a meal the state had prepared for him, inadvertently changed the policy for every condemned prisoner in Texas who came after him. He was strapped to the gurney. When asked if he had a final statement, he replied, "No. I have no final statement." He was pronounced dead at 6:21 in the evening. A single tear was observed on his right cheek as the drugs took effect. Byrd's sisters were present in the witness room. One of them had also witnessed the execution of the other perpetrator, John William King, when his turn came 8 years later in 2019. She said on that occasion that even execution was too easy for what they had done to her brother. James Byrd Jr. did not get to go to sleep. He did not get that choice. Anthony Shore grew up in Houston, Texas, in circumstances that gave no outward indication of what he would become. He was born on February 20, 1962, and by the standards of his own biography presented in court, his early life was one of relative normalcy. He attended school, held jobs, married, and had children. The image he projected to the world around him was one of an ordinary man navigating ordinary life. That image was, in every documented respect, a complete fabrication. Behind it, beginning in the mid-1980s, Anthony Shore was sexually assaulting and murdering young women and girls in Houston, leaving their bodies in fields and behind buildings with rope or cord tied around their necks in the distinctive tourniquet pattern that would eventually give him his nickname. For more than 17 years, no one in Anthony Shore's immediate world suspected what he was doing. His neighbors did not suspect it. His employers did not suspect it. And law enforcement had no idea who had killed 4 young women and girls in Houston over a span of nearly a decade. His 4 confirmed victims were Maria del Carmen Estrada, 21 years old, killed in 1992, Lori Tremblay, 14 years old, killed in 1994, Diana Rebelar, 9 years old, killed in 1994, and Dana Sanchez, 16 years old, killed in 1995. Each victim was sexually assaulted and strangled, their bodies left in locations suggesting Shore had moved them after death. Each had cord or rope tied around her neck in the same deliberate configuration. The youngest victim, Diana Rebelar, was 9 years old. The detail of her age was one that prosecutors returned to repeatedly during Shore's trial, and it was one that appeared in virtually every piece of press coverage of the case, because it encapsulated the particular depravity of what Anthony Shore had done behind the facade of his ordinary life. He was not caught through an active murder investigation. He was caught through a DNA database match. In 1998, Shore pleaded no contest to charges of sexually molesting both of his daughters, and a DNA sample was collected and entered into the Texas State database as a matter of routine procedure. In 2003, that sample was matched to biological evidence recovered from the 1992 murder scene of Maria del Carmen Estrada. Investigators brought Shore in for questioning. He confessed. He confessed not only to the Estrada murder but to the murders of all 4 young women, walking investigators through each case in detail. The Harris County District Attorney's Office prosecuted him for the murder of Maria del Carmen Estrada, which carried the clearest physical evidence and the DNA match that had broken the case. In 2004, Shore was convicted and sentenced to death. He was transferred to the Huntsville Unit on death row where he remained for over 13 years. During that time, the case generated continuing legal scrutiny because Shore at various points suggested he might have information about additional unsolved murders in the Houston area, leading investigators from Montgomery County and other jurisdictions to pursue interviews with him. After extensive investigation, those leads did not produce additional confirmed victims. On January 18, 2018, Shore was transported to the Huntsville Unit. He was the first person executed in the United States in 2018. His final statement was a direct address to the families of his victims. He said that no amount of words could ever undo what he had done and asked for forgiveness. He was pronounced dead at 6:28 in the evening, 13 minutes after the lethal injection was administered. Anthony Shore was 55 years old. The 4 families whose daughters and sisters he had killed sat with that fact in the silence that followed. That was the story of Anthony Shore. But the final chapter of this documentary belongs to the man who completed the circle opened by Lawrence Russell Brewer, the co-architect of one of the most vicious hate crime murders in the history of the American South. John William King was born on June 21, 1974, in Jasper, Texas, the town where he would eventually commit the crime that made his name permanently associated with racial violence in modern America. He grew up in Jasper, attended school there, and was by accounts of people who knew him in his youth an unremarkable young man in most external respects. He became involved in burglary in his late teens and served time in a Texas state prison, where he met Lawrence Russell Brewer and became deeply embedded in the Confederate Knights of America, the white supremacist prison gang that would define the direction of his adult life. He emerged from prison covered in racist tattoos, including Ku Klux Klan symbols, a swastika, and a visual depiction of a lynching. He moved back to Jasper and invited Brewer to join him. The rest of what happened on the night of June 7, 1998 has been fully documented in this film through the account of Lawrence Russell Brewer. What the Brewer chapter did not fully address is the question of who was truly responsible for the planning and instigation of James Byrd's murder. At trial and throughout his subsequent appeals, John William King maintained his absolute innocence, claiming he had not been present at the scene. His own jail note to Brewer, "We have made history," suggested otherwise to the jury. A week before Brewer's execution in 2011, Brewer confirmed to investigators that the entire plan had been King's idea from the beginning. King was tried first and separately in Jasper, convicted of capital murder, and sentenced to death in February of 1999. He spent the next 20 years on the Huntsville Unit death row, the longest of any of the three men convicted in the case, filing appeal after appeal on the grounds that his trial attorneys had refused to assert his innocence claim despite his explicit instructions to do so. Every appeal was denied. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied his final clemency request on the day of his execution. On April 24, 2019, John William King was transported to the Huntsville Unit and strapped to the gurney in the execution chamber. His final statement was a single word: no. He was pronounced dead at 7:55 in the evening. He was 44 years old. Byrd's sister Lou Von Harris, who had also witnessed the execution of Lawrence Russell Brewer 8 years earlier, was present in the witness room. She said afterward that he was still getting off easy because his body was not flying behind a pickup truck being pulled apart. James Byrd Jr. did not get that mercy. What most people watching this documentary do not know is that the 7 executions documented in this film are connected by something beyond the facility where they took place and beyond the horror of the crimes themselves. They are connected by a set of institutional failures, specific, documented, and in several cases formally acknowledged by the state of Texas, that either created the conditions for the crimes or extended the period during which the killers remained free. Kenneth McDuff was released on parole from a death sentence because of prison overcrowding driven by federal court orders, and the systemic collapse that allowed that release was not corrected until after he had killed again. Rafael Resendez-Ramirez was apprehended and released by American law enforcement agencies at least 3 times during his active killing period because interagency data sharing systems were not functional, a failure documented by a congressional subcommittee and subsequently reformed. Anthony Shore's DNA was in a Texas state database from 1998 but was not matched to a murder scene until 2003. A 5-year gap during which the system possessed the evidence needed to identify him but lacked the processing infrastructure to act on it. Lawrence Russell Brewer and John William King were both radicalized inside the Texas prison system itself, in a documented environment where white supremacist gang activity was known to exist and where the mechanisms for disrupting that radicalization were insufficient. Each of these failures was investigated. Each was formally documented. Reforms followed in every case. But the reforms followed the deaths. They did not precede them. And that sequence, crisis, death, reform, repeat, is the documented pattern that runs through the entire history of the Huntsville Unit and the system it represents, a pattern that did not end with the last execution in this film and that continues to shape the lives of the hundreds of men and women currently housed on Texas death row today.